I want to start by saying something that I know is going to make some of you stop watching. And I get it. I really do, but I think after everything that happened, you deserve to know the truth before I tell you the rest of this story. And the truth is that for 3 years, almost everything you saw on our channel was fake. Not fake like we hired actors or anything like that, but fake like we would walk into a place and agree beforehand on who was going to pretend to hear something, and who was going to grab whose shoulder from behind, and what direction we were all going to look when Derek did his thing with the EMF reader, which he had rigged to go off whenever he pressed a button on the side of it. And we were good at it. And we had about 200,000 subscribers across our platforms, and a website where we sold merch and early access videos. So it was a real thing. It was our job, and none of us felt particularly bad about it, because we told ourselves we were just entertaining people. And besides, we never once found anything real in 3 years of doing this. My name is Marcus, and I did the presenting, the camera work, and most of the research and writing. The other 4 were Derek, who handled the equipment, Jess, who was our audio person, and also the one who usually acted like she could feel something touching her, and then Tyler and Nora, who were a couple that had been doing urban exploration videos before they joined us, so they were already comfortable walking around abandoned buildings at night, which is the main skill you need for what we did. We had been looking for a new location for about 2 months because our last few videos had done okay, but not great, and Derek had found a mention of this place in a forum thread about abandoned institutions in West Virginia. It was called the Harlan Children's Psychiatric Center, and it had been shut down in 1991 after a state investigation found that several of the staff had been conducting what the report described as unauthorized treatment procedures on patients, most of whom were children between the ages of 6 and 14. 3 of the doctors had been criminally charged, and 2 of them actually went to prison. The facility had just been left there after that, sitting in about 40 acres of forest in the hills east of a town called Parsons, with no road leading to it anymore because the county had stopped maintaining the access road sometime in the mid-90s, and the forest had taken most of it back. That history was actually perfect for us, because we didn't need to invent much. We could just read the real facts on camera and let the actual story do the work. And then we would do our usual thing with the sounds and the equipment, and Jess grabbing her own arm and looking behind her. It would make for a good video, a really good one actually, because the real backstory was really disturbing to the point you didn't have to exaggerate it. The only way to get there was by helicopter, which cost us more money than we had ever spent on a single video. We hired a company out of Elkins that did aerial tours and private charters, and the pilot's name was Greg. He had a 2-seat Robinson that he said could make 2 trips, so he took Derek and the equipment first, and then came back for the rest of us. I remember sitting in the clearing where he dropped us, and watching the helicopter get smaller and smaller above the trees, and thinking that it was a long time until the next morning when he was scheduled to pick us up. But it was a good feeling, like the kind of nervous excitement you get before something that you know is going to go well. The building was about a 1/4 mile from where Greg had set us down in a clearing that looked like it used to be a parking lot. You could still see faint lines in the cracked asphalt where the spaces had been painted. We walked the path through the trees, and then it just appeared in front of us, and I want to try to describe it accurately because I think the location matters for understanding what happened later. It was a 4-story brick building that had been painted white at some point, but now looked more gray than anything, with most of the windows either broken or covered in plywood that had warped and peeled away from the frames over 30 years. It was bigger than I expected, maybe 300 feet wide, with 2 wings that extended back from the main entrance, so that the whole thing was shaped roughly like a U from above. And behind it, directly behind the back of the building, there was a rock face, a massive slab of gray stone that rose up from the ground at a slight angle and went maybe 60 or 70 feet high. It was like someone had pushed a section of mountain up through the soil, and it was wider than the building itself, which made the whole place feel enclosed, like the building was sitting in a corner it couldn't get out of. The trees came right up to both sides, so that the only real open space was the approach from the front where we had come in. We spent most of the afternoon walking through it, and I will say that even knowing we were going to fake everything, even knowing that the plan was to just do our usual script and leave in the morning, the building still had a feeling to it that I am not sure how to describe. Not scary exactly, just heavy, like the air inside was different from the air outside, and had been sitting in there for a long time without moving. The floors were covered in debris, broken ceiling tiles and old furniture. In a few rooms there were still pieces of equipment, metal frames that had held something, mounted brackets on the walls, restraint rails on some of the beds that were still bolted to the floors. Nora found a room on the second floor that still had a child's drawing taped to the wall, yellowed and curled at the corners but still there. It was a drawing of a house with a sun above it and stick figures in front of it. She photographed it but didn't say anything about it, and neither did anyone else. Tyler found the basement access through a door in the back hallway, and we went down there together with our flashlights. It was mostly storage, old filing cabinets and shelving units and cardboard boxes that had long since turned to pulp. In the far corner there was a room with a heavy door and a small observation window in it, the kind of door you would see on a cold storage unit. The door was open and the room inside was maybe 10 by 10 feet, with concrete walls and a drain in the floor and nothing else. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a little while, and then we went back upstairs and nobody said what we were all thinking. We did our setup in the early afternoon, placed the equipment, ran through the script, and argued for a while about whether Jess should do the thing with the sounds in the basement or on the third floor because the acoustics were better upstairs, but the basement was visually more interesting. We settled on the basement, and Tyler said he would do the thing where he pretended to be shoved from behind on the second floor hallway because the long corridor there looked good on camera. Around 5 we went outside and set up the camera facing the front of the building. I did the intro piece, walked toward the building while talking about the history, mentioned the doctors' names, mentioned the investigation, described what the unauthorized procedures were alleged to have involved, which was a combination of prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and in some cases chemical sedation of children as young as 6 years old. I said all of this in my regular on-camera voice, measured and serious, and Derek watched the monitor and told me it looked great. We then stopped recording and just let the evening come. We had a small camp set up in the main entrance hall, sleeping bags, and a folding table with a cooler on it. We sat around it and ate sandwiches as Derek played music from his phone, and Nora was telling a story about a hotel they had stayed in during the urban exploration days that had a genuinely strange layout. Rooms that didn't connect to anything, a staircase on the outside of the building that led to a door that opened onto a wall, and we were laughing and it felt like any other job. The light outside the windows had turned that particular shade of orange that means you have maybe 40 minutes before it gets dark, and honestly, this was the part of these trips that I actually liked. The hour before it got dark when you were still comfortable and the night hadn't started yet. Jess had gone outside to get something from one of the equipment bags we had left near the entrance. I heard her walking on the gravel outside. Then she came back through the front door and she had one hand pressed against her upper arm and she was walking fast and her face looked like something had been removed from it. All the expression just gone, and she said in a completely flat voice that something had hit her. Derek asked what she meant, and she took her hand away from her arm, and there was an arrow sticking out of it. Not deep, maybe an inch or so of the shaft buried in the meat of her upper arm, and the rest of it sticking straight out. A wooden shaft with dark fletching. It was so out of place that for a second I did not understand what I was looking at. My brain kept trying to file it under something that made sense. Derek said the word he said, and we were all moving at once. Tyler grabbed Jess and got her away from the doorway, and I slammed the front door, which still had its frame and most of its weight. I pushed the old reception desk that had been sitting in the entrance hall against it, not because I thought it would actually stop anything, but because my hands needed to do something. Derek was at the window looking out at the tree line through a gap in the plywood. Nora was with Jess, saying her name over and over in a low voice, while pressing her jacket against Jess's arm around the arrow which we had decided not to pull out. Outside, it was almost completely dark now. The orange had gone out of the sky fast, the way it does in the hills when the trees are high and close on all sides. Derek said quietly that he could see movement at the edge of the trees, maybe 100 yards out. I asked him what kind of movement, and he said he didn't know. It was just shapes. And then he stepped back from the window because we both understood at the same time that if you could see out, something out there could see in. We had our phones, but there was no signal inside the building. I had checked when we first arrived and gotten a weak bar outside near the clearing where Greg had dropped us. That clearing was about a quarter-mile away through open ground in the dark, with whatever was in those trees between us and it. The helicopter wasn't scheduled until 6 in the morning, which was more than 10 hours away. Jess was on the floor with her back against the wall, and she said the arrow had come out of the tree line and she hadn't heard it before it hit her. No sound of a bowstring or anything, just the impact. She said it hadn't hurt at first, but then the pain was sharp. She was speaking slowly and clearly the way people do when they are trying very hard not to fall apart. Derek turned off his flashlight and said we should all turn ours off too. In the dark, I could hear Jess breathing carefully beside me, and somewhere above us on one of the upper floors something moved, a slow dragging sound. One long pull across the floor, and then silence. The sound from upstairs lasted maybe 3 seconds before stopping. Tyler whispered that it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a possum that had gotten in through one of the broken windows on the upper floors. I didn't say anything back because he wasn't really saying it for my benefit. He was saying it because he needed to say something that was still inside the world we had been living in 20 minutes ago. The world where the scariest thing in an abandoned building was a sound you couldn't immediately identify. And I understood that. And I let him have it. And we all sat in the dark and listened. What I was thinking about was the layout of the building, because I had spent enough time walking through it that afternoon that I had a reasonable picture of it in my head. The front entrance where we were, the 2 long hallways going back into each wing, the stairwells at the end of each wing and one in the center behind the main desk, the basement below us, and the back of the building which sat maybe 30 feet from the base of that rock face, which meant that the back of the building had no open ground behind it. You could not approach from that direction in any useful way, and the windows on the upper floors on the back wall looked out directly onto stone, so that felt like something like one direction we didn't have to think about. What I could not stop thinking about was who fires an arrow at a person in the woods in West Virginia, and the answer I kept arriving at was nobody, or at least nobody operating within the set of rules and behaviors that the rest of us were operating within. Derek had moved to a different window, one that gave him a partial view of the right side of the building, and after a while he came back and sat close to me and said very quietly that he had seen a light in the trees. Not a flashlight, more like a flame, something being carried, and that it had moved from the right side toward the front, and then he had lost it. Jess had the arrow out by then. Tyler had pulled it while Nora held her arm still, and she had made a sound that I am not going to try to describe, and then it was done. They had wrapped her arm tightly with a shirt from Tyler's bag. She was in pain, but she was clear-headed, and she was the one who pointed out that we should barricade the hallways as well as the front door, because we were sitting in the entrance area which had 4 different directions something could come from. She was right, so we spent about 15 minutes moving debris and old furniture to block the hallway entrances on both sides. Not anything that would stop a person who really wanted to get through, but enough that we would hear it. The night moved in that way that bad nights move, where time seems to do something wrong, where an hour can feel like 20 minutes and 10 minutes can feel like an hour, and you keep checking the time and being surprised in both directions. We sat close together against the wall farthest from the front door and tried to be quiet. Around midnight, maybe a little after, something hit the front of the building, a heavy impact against the door that moved the reception desk a few inches across the floor. Just one hit, and then nothing. We waited for a second impact, but it didn't come. We sat there for 40 minutes without anyone saying a word. Jess with her wrapped arm across her chest, Derek with his hand on the largest piece of broken furniture within reach, which was a chair leg, and Nora had found a fire extinguisher in the entrance hall earlier, which she was holding in her lap. Tyler had a utility knife open in his hand, and I had nothing. I had not thought to arm myself with anything because up until a few hours ago the scariest thing I had ever done for work was pretend to hear my name called in an empty room in Ohio. Then the sounds started upstairs again, and this time they were different. This time they were footsteps. They moved from one side of the building to the other above us, the full width of the second floor, and then stopped at what I calculated was roughly the central stairwell, directly above and behind the reception desk. The stairwell door at the top was closed. I had checked it that afternoon because it had a good look for camera, heavy fire door with a small wired glass window. I watched that door in the dark and tried to remember if I had pulled it fully shut or just pushed it to, and I could not remember. And the fact that I could not remember felt like the most important thing in the world. The footsteps started again, and this time they were on the stairs. I could hear them clearly. One step and then a pause. And another step and a pause, coming down slowly. Derek grabbed my arm and pointed at the door. We both moved toward it at the same time, and I hit it with my shoulder just as it swung inward. I felt resistance on the other side. Not a huge force, but something, like pushing a door against wind, and I got my back against it and Derek got his weight against it beside me, and it held. Tyler came and added his weight, and we stood there in the dark with our backs against a stairwell door, and three of us were breathing like we had been running. It stopped pushing after a few seconds, and then there was nothing from the other side. We stood there anyway for a long time. Eventually, Tyler wedged a broken shelf bracket under the bottom of the door, and we backed away from it. I noticed that my hands were shaking in a way that felt separate from me, like my hands had gotten the information before the rest of me had processed it. At some point, Nora said she could smell something, and I thought she was imagining it at first, but then I smelled it too. Something like wood smoke, and something underneath it that I cannot describe accurately, except to say that it was organic. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the front. It was faint, but it was there, and Jess said she smelled it too, but we didn't talk about what it might mean as we were too busy trying to survive. The worst moment of the night happened around 2 in the morning. I was sitting against the wall with my knees up, not asleep, but not fully awake, in that gray state where you are aware of everything but not actively thinking. I heard a voice from outside, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the front door, a human voice, a man's voice. It said something that I could not make out clearly. The consonants were right, but the words were not quite words, like someone speaking a language that was almost English, but not, or like someone who had learned to approximate speech without fully understanding what speech was for. It said whatever it said 2 times, the same sounds both times, and then it stopped. Then I heard another voice from the other side of the building, further away, that said something back, also almost language. They were communicating, and there were at least 2 of them. They were on different sides of the building, and they were talking about something at 2 in the morning. The rest of the night I can only describe as endurance. We had no more direct contact. Nothing hit the door again. The footsteps on the second floor came back twice more, and both times moved slowly from one end to the other, and then went quiet. Once at around 4 in the morning we heard something outside, one of the side windows, something close. Nora was nearest to it, and she moved away from the wall very slowly without making any sound. She came and sat between Tyler and Derek, and we just waited. After a while, whatever was at the window was not there anymore, or at least we couldn't hear it anymore. The sky outside started going from black to gray somewhere around 5:30, and I checked my phone for the 100th time, and for the first time since 9 the previous night, I felt something other than dread, which was just the plain desire to get to that clearing before Greg arrived, so we were there when he came over the trees. At 5:45 I said we should go, and everyone stood up immediately. They had been thinking the same thing, and we put on our bags. Tyler and Derek picked up Jess between them because her arm had stiffened overnight, and walking was harder. Nora still had the fire extinguisher, and I remember thinking that was both a good idea and probably useless, and she brought it anyway. We moved the desk from the front door, and I opened it slowly. I looked out at the gray morning and the gravel lot, and the tree line beyond it. Everything looked perfectly still and ordinary. Just a gray dawn in the West Virginia hills. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the tree line, and then we went out, moving as fast as Jess could manage, across the gravel and onto the path through the trees. I kept looking left and right into the trees as we walked. The light was still weak enough that the forest was mostly shadow, shapes and distances that were hard to read. I was looking so hard at the tree line that I almost didn't notice what was on the path until Derek stopped walking. There was something on the path, placed in the center of it, set there like it had been left for us. It was a bundle of sticks tied together with what looked like cord, maybe 8 or 10 sticks bound at the center into a rough shape. Not quite a figure, not quite anything recognizable, but clearly made by hands, and it was fresh. The sticks were pale where they had been broken from branches, and the ends were not weathered. It had not been there the previous afternoon when we had walked this path in the other direction. Derek looked at it and then stepped around it and kept walking, and we all stepped around it without stopping. We heard the helicopter before we reached the clearing, and I have never been so grateful for a sound in my life. We came out of the trees into the cracked asphalt of the old parking lot, and I could see it coming over the ridge to the east. We stood in the open and waved. Greg came down, and when he saw Jess's arm, he asked what had happened. Tyler said she had fallen, but Greg was looking at each of us and said we all looked terrible. Tyler said we'd had a rough night, and we all entered into the helicopter, leaving the equipment behind. We took Jess to a hospital in Elkins, and they cleaned and dressed the wound and asked what had happened. She said she had been struck by debris while exploring an abandoned building, a piece of metal rod, and they accepted that and sent us home. That was the last time any of us has been in the same room together, because we never officially disbanded the channel. We just all separately stopped answering messages about it, stopped logging into the accounts, stopped responding to the emails about our merch shop, and after a while the community we had built noticed the silence and mostly moved on, and I don't blame them. That is what audiences do. I am not going to tell you what I think was living in those woods, partly because I am not sure, and partly because naming a thing does something to it, makes it smaller and more manageable than it actually is, and I would rather leave it the size it actually was, which was large enough to change every single thing I thought I understood about what empty places are and what they remember. What I will tell you is this, and then I am done with it. About a week after we got back, I looked up the Harlan Children's Psychiatric Center in some more detail than I had gone into for the video research, looking at some of the original news coverage from the early 90s. I found a detail that I had missed in my initial research, a small note in a county sheriff's report from 1991 that was included in the investigation file. It was a note about the original anonymous tip that had led investigators to the facility in the first place, and the note said that the tip had come in by phone. The caller had reported hearing sounds coming from the building at night, sounds that carried down through the trees to a logging road about a mile away, and the caller had described the sounds as voices, multiple voices, speaking in a way that was hard to understand. The investigation had focused entirely on the staff and the records and the physical evidence inside the building, which was what put those doctors in prison. The voices the caller had heard were never followed up on because they were assumed to be patients, and after the building was cleared out and closed, the file was closed with it.